you've got this by comparison, we'll go to this. This is what Graham was just talking about, Camas Prairie. And what you see here is there's ranches out there, and you've got this 10-mile long field of these gigantic ripples. And if you look up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you can see some of these ripples. They're, like Graham said, they're 100 to 300 feet in wavelength, and they're up to 50 feet in amplitude. And the water that flowed through here that deposited this was over 1,000 feet deep.
So this is fractal. This is fractal. You
Fractal,
get it.
exactly.
You get it in the small scale. In the first image, Randall showed the same phenomenon there with a flood just 2 feet deep, and then we come to this humongous testimony to what happened 12,800 years ago. And it's easy to drive through it and not really figure what you're driving through, but once you look at it and realize what happened, it really dilates the imagination.
So this must have been just an absolutely enormous event when it happened, and really sudden.
Unimaginable, and human beings lived through that, and it changed everything. They're called extinction level events. These global cataclysms wipe the slate clean. They change everything, and they set a new order in motion. A new order follows that. So the classic example is the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. That turned dinosaurs into chickens, you know. And they were gone, and it opened the way for mammals. And our distant ancestor is a sort of 65-million-year-old shrew, which was going nowhere until the dinosaurs were wiped by. And then they began to evolve. And here we are. So dinosaurs became chickens.
That's almost harder for me to imagine than this. This is very hard for me to wrap my head around, but that we came from a shrew 65 million years ago.
Well, that's
harder.
That's the story of evolution. You can buy into it or not, but certainly mammals were going nowhere before the dinosaurs were swept out of the way. And the point I'm making is that these events, which are called extinction level events, they reset the clock. They make everything start again. And this is why what happened in North America 12,800 years ago is so important. Because that period, the whole period was 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. That period stands right in the foundations of what we think of as the beginnings, the origins of civilization, and yet mainstream archaeology and historians have not taken into account. And I don't blame them. This is new information. This is new science that's been mainly published in professional journals since 2007. It's very intriguing new information, but we cannot any longer trust the established model of the origins of civilization, since it does not take into account an extinction level event right in the foundations. And that's why I say the House of History appears to be built on foundations of sand.
Now, this hasn't been adopted yet, but is it resisted? Has mainstream?
Yes.
It is. It's being resisted.
Whenever you propose a cataclysm of any kind, it's a curious thing. I don't know whether it's psychological or something more sinister than that, but whenever you propose that and present evidence for it, you can be sure that you will be descended upon by a furious crowd of critics. And the group of scientists, more than 30 of them, very significant capable scientists who've been presenting the evidence for atomic effect, have had a fight for that since 2007, but I can say with confidence, and I detail it at length in the book, that they have won that fight. Every criticism that's been made of their work, they have refuted, and they've come back with new evidence, sometimes 3 or 4 papers a year, and it's a compelling case, and we can't ignore it.
Well, it seems to me as a casual observer, I mean, more casual, probably more into it than the average person, but no, not even close to you guys, that as this evidence piles up, like the nuclear glass that they keep finding, it's about 12,000.
That's one of what they call the impact proxies. Yeah. See, what we've got to consider is that we are looking at objects which might be a mile wide, that are coming into the atmosphere at 70,000 miles an hour, and they are hot. You know, some people will remember Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 that hit Jupiter back in 1994. That was a small comet, just 2 kilometers wide, broke into about 20 fragments. The explosive power of those impacts on Jupiter was 300 gigatons. Now let me put that into perspective. The entire world's nuclear arsenal, were it to go off at once, would be 6.4 gigatons. So you're looking at something beyond imagination. The power of these impacts is absolutely colossal. Numbers. Just imagine a world on fire. The world
Wasn't
changed.
the explosion that hit Jupiter was about the size of the Earth, too, right?
No. This was a comet. About
I mean, the
plume.
impact,
Oh, the
plume
plume, yes.
itself.
It was like the size of the Earth.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So we're looking at something that when it happened, it was, what's the timeline around? What the calculations around? Somewhere around 11,000 years ago.
Well, there's actually a period. This is an episode rather than a single incident, and that's part of the mystery. First off, there are the impacts 12,800 years ago. That causes this cataclysm centered on North America, but global. And global temperature plummets. I mean, people who talk about global warming or today, what happened? The change in temperature 12,800 years ago is just stunning.
And this is undeniable.
This is
Randall's
undeniable.
detailed this in depth
Yes.
the last time he was here
Absolutely.
with mainstream scientific data that's irrefutable.
Absolutely.
Core samples, ice core samples, things
Absolutely.
along those lines.
And they geologists call it the Younger Dryas, and it's a 1,200-year period. Temperatures plunge at the beginning, massive animal extinctions, and then 1,200 years later, equally suddenly, temperatures shoot up again, dramatically. And there's another series of floods. So the period is 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. And I don't know if Randall agrees, we're sure that the comet was the cause of the first event, 12,800 years ago. I think other bits of the comet were responsible for the second event as well. I think there was an impact in ocean, which threw water vapor up into the upper atmosphere, caused a greenhouse effect, and created that sudden spike in warming and that huge flood.
Those two warming spikes show up very dramatically in the Greenland ice cores. And I pulled these up, I think, in the last meeting, but it would be good to reference it again. And basically what you see here is warming spike number 1 is here, and warming spike number 2 is here. And these were extreme, we're talking about 10 degrees centigrade, roughly, in perhaps a year or two. And this translates into about 17 or 18 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're talking many times greater than the warming of the last century or two. Instantly, basically just like that. And this what we see here brackets this whole episode of this period of transition from the glacial age to this nice warm Holocene interglacial age that we're in now. And Graham brought up about how this sits right at the very foundation of our modern history. And if you look at whether it's the dispersion of languages, the beginning of agriculture, the first cities, the domestication of animals, what you see over and over again is the same dates showing up, 8, 9, 10,000 years ago. And in this model that we're describing here, we're not really seeing the genesis of civilization. We're seeing the rebooting of civilization in the aftermath of these events.
It's the only thing that makes sense. This is we have now the data that makes sense of what previously has been very mysterious and unexplained evidence.
So, for folks who are not aware of both of your work, to me this is so fascinating because I've been a fan of your book since, God, I mean, more than a decade, right? When did it come out, in the 90s?
Well, Fingerprints of the Gods
Yes.
was published in 1995, which is 20 years ago, and Magicians of the Gods, the new book, is the sequel to Fingerprints, and I've written it because there's just this massive new information that changes the whole picture completely.
Fingerprints of the Gods I started reading sometime in the late 90s and just became engrossed in it and fascinated. Has amnesia, and that we just forgot what our past was. But the two of you together is what's so fascinating because it puts this puzzle together. Your obsession with asteroidal impacts and these massive extinction events, and your knowledge of this ancient architecture that doesn't make any sense, and these ancient construction methods. The Sphinx has thousands of years of rainfall erosion. That doesn't make any sense because the last time there was rain in the Nile Valley was like 9,000 BC, which is right somewhere around there.
Yes, really, the climate of of Egypt has been as dry as it is today for about the last 5,000 years. So you have to go back, you actually have to go back to this period, to this Younger Dryas period, to get those heavy rainfalls that could have eroded the Sphinx in the way it is. And I want to pay tribute to the work of John Anthony West and Robert Schoch from Boston University, because they broke this story way back in 1992. And at the time, the Egyptological establishment, of course, were furious that anybody dared to suggest that the Sphinx might be 12,000 years old. The Egyptologists said, we know the Sphinx dates from 2500 BC. Actually, one of the things I've done in this book is look at what the Egyptological case rests on. And it's a fairy tale. It rests on nothing. It's kind of ideology. It's their idea of how things should be, rather than any real factual evidence that puts the Sphinx at 2500 BC. And the geology puts the Sphinx much, much older. Now, the argument of the archaeologists at the time was, and anyway, the Sphinx couldn't possibly be 12,000 years old, because if that was the work of some unknown culture 12,000 years ago, we're going to find lots of other monuments around the world that are 12,000 years old, and we don't find any. Well, that was 1992, but now we're in 2015, and the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey has been discovered with its gigantic megaliths, a deliberately buried time capsule, buried more than 10,000 years ago and created 11,500 years ago. And if you can make Göbekli Tepe, you can make the Sphinx. We are finding that fingerprints of this lost civilization popping up all around the world, indeed on any archaeological site where you can be absolutely sure of the dating. The dating proves to be much older than we have been taught by archaeologists. They recently discovered a huge megalithic site 40 meters underwater in the Sicily Channel. It's been underwater for best part of 10,000 years, which means that megalithic site is at least that old and maybe much older. And we can be sure about the dating because it's underwater. Likewise, we can be sure of the dating of Göbekli Tepe because whoever made it deliberately buried it, sealed it, and no later organic material got in to contaminate the carbon dating record and give us.
And if they didn't bury it, someone else during that time period.
Somebody buried it. They went
We don't know when it was built, but we know it's buried at least.
Well, the dates that are coming out of it now, the earliest dates, it's important to be clear that there's much more than Göbekli Tepe. Right. There's actually about 50 times as much already being excavated, which is under the ground still, not been dug up yet. They know it's there, because you know the whole site was ground penetrating radar. What they're seeing is these huge 20 to 50 ton T-shaped megalithic pillars buried under the ground. So just as somebody went to enormous lengths to create this, they also know somebody else. And actually Göbekli Tepe means pot-bellied pillars. And that whole pot-bellied hill that covers the site was artificially put there by human beings, men and women, with buckets filled with rubble and stones, filling it in, covering it up.
So strange, and there's no guesses or theories as to why they did this?
Really not. There's not. It's just a fact that it happened because archaeologists and geologists can tell from the nature of the material that covers these pillars that it isn't a natural sedimentation, that they were deliberately covered up.
Well, it's got to be satisfying to you guys, too, obsessed crazy men, come together, and your theories lock in like puzzle pieces, and ha-ha! And
well, you've got the right word there, because
obsessed
this is
crazy man.
Yes, definitely.
Well, I'm glad you're obsessed crazy man. I say that with all love and respect.
I put my hand up to that. Absolutely, you've got to be a bit obsessed to stick with some shit. I came in for an enormous amount of criticism and flack when I published Ignorance of the Gods, and I'm human. It hurts when people say really bad things about me, but what I've learned is you just have to persist. You just have to keep going, even if your ideas are shouted down by, the established holders of knowledge in our society. If you feel strongly enough about those ideas, you've got to hang with them. And I've hung with these ideas for more than 20 years now. And what we're seeing is just a mass of new evidence that basically vindicates the notion of a lost civilization. See, if I may say, Göbekli Tepe, the earliest dates they've pulled out of the ground now, which they think is the foundation of the site, 11,600 years ago. And that is really significant, because 11,600 years ago was the second episode of Cataclysm at the end of the Human Rise, and we know it was accompanied by massive global flooding. This is possible.
possible that this was covered up then? That it wasn't covered up intentionally by people, that it was covered up as a part of that cataclysm?
It was made after the cataclysm was over. Implications to the Göbekli Tepe. And you see, the problem archaeology has is that up till now, they've been teaching far bigger than any other megalith. At least 6,000 years older than any other. Hunter-gatherers of that game, not with megalithic architecture and how to organize a workforce and how to bring them to a site which, by the way, there's no water on that site, and to put this whole proposition together, and at the same time, exactly the same It's like Göbekli Tepe is a center of innovation, and associated with it is the birth of agriculture in Turkey. It doesn't woke up that morning magically equipped with the ability to invent agriculture and create a megalithic site like this. It looks to me like people who already had that knowledge came into that area, settled there, and tried to pass on their knowledge to the local people, and maybe used Göbekli Tepe as a kind of university or initiation center to train and teach people in those skills. That's what it feels like. And another point is that that same date, 11,600 years ago, is the date that Plato gives us for the destruction and submergence by flood of the lost civilization of Atlantis. And up till now, archaeologists have dismissed the whole Atlantis story, and they regard it as kind of pseudoscience, although it comes from Plato. But Plato said very clearly that this happened 9,000 years before the time of Solon, and Solon lived in 600 BC, so Plato is telling us Atlantis went down 9,600 BC, 11,600 years ago. Wow. Exactly the date of the second spike of the Younger Dryas cataclysm.
If you look here at this graph, we see...
Randall, pull this sucker up close to you so that you get a little bit more...
We can see here, these are studies of sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. And rather than it being a smooth curve, which was the old model, which you can see represented by the dashed line, it's two enormous spikes. And that second spike, you see MWP-1B, that's meltwater pulse 1B. And you've got meltwater pulse 1A. Meltwater pulse 1B is dated precisely to 11,600 years ago.
This is crazy. It's like everything aligns. Everything aligns. The nuclear glass that they're finding, the core samples.
Well, yeah,
that's all the same.
This was the point I wanted to make. We talked about these objects coming in at 70,000 miles an hour. They are packing an enormous amount of kinetic energy. When they hit the ground, there are distinct products left in the soil, and those include nanodimes. They're created by the shock of the engine. You can see them under a microscope, tiny things. And carbon spherules, and the melt glass, which is just basically identical to trinitite, which is the melt glass that you get from nuclear explosions. They're called impact proxies, and there's a distinct layer of the soil all around the world, dated to 12,800 years ago, which contains this stuff, and also contains the evidence of continental wildfires burning. And I think Randall might want to address that issue of continental wildfires and why they happen.
All these images are beautiful. Would note that most people are just listening to this. So if you're just listening to this, those images that Randall put up on the screen show these enormous straight up and down spikes of the water level rising, which has to be caused by something. Ocean level rising, which has to be caused by something extremely dramatic. Like that, just looking at that, wow, what happened? That's
Well,
nuts.
That's the melting of the ice sheets. The sudden, rapid, catastrophic meltdown of the ice sheets, dumping millions of cubic kilometers of water back into the ocean.
And how those little dashes on the bottom, the numbers, how many years do they represent? That spike that goes straight up and down, the largest spike, how much time does that represent?
Well, you've got two here that basically represent the margin of error in the news. The earliest version of it is the spike you see on the right. The latest version you see is on the left. And it varies between about 14 and 13 years for the first spike. The second spike now is about, like I said, about 11,600. The numbers across the bottom are KYR, means thousands of years before present. So you can see 9, 10, that would be 10,000 years ago.
So essentially it seems like our Earth went through 1,000 years of hard.
1,000 years. It's really impossible to imagine what the world is like for people who live. And I think it makes sense why all around the world we have a story. This is not something confined to the story of Noah in the Bible. It's a universal story that has changed the world and wiped away the golden age and left us with the present order of things all around the world. And secondly, all around the world, which is intriguing, there is a universal fear of comets. Now, why should we be afraid of comets? We see comets up in the sky, they look nice tail, they look be scared of them. But every culture in the world has myths and traditions that associate comets with disaster. And I think it's pretty obvious why. Because this comet in 1,000 years is memory by the survivors. And they pass that memory down to their children and their children's children. And it's still with us today. And it's now we know, based on something very real.
Well, it seems like to me, as a layperson, with all of this evidence, and all this evidence that correlates, it's all corresponding, it all seems to fit together, it would seem that this would be something that a lot of mainstream scientists and archaeologists would be extremely interested in. Like, why would they try to ignore something like this?
The first thing they've tried to do is to get rid of it. This is often the case where new information emerges that contradicts established theory. And it's a strange phenomenon in science because we like to think of scientists as rational and reasonable people. But the fact is that when you get very committed to a particular model, to a particular idea, I think you start to connect your own personality to it. And any attack on that idea becomes an existential attack on you yourself.
How sad.
And it is sad because again and again what we see is the new facts being dismissed because they don't fit the existing theory, where in fact what we should be doing is modifying the existing theory to explain the newly discovered facts. And this is a problem in the whole history of science.
Well, I remember when I first became aware of that problem when I watched the documentary on the mysteries of the Sphinx, where Dr. Robert Schoch met with some archaeologist in Egypt. It wasn't Zawi Hawass, it was a Western guy. And he met with this guy, and they were explaining their theory about the erosions of the Sphinx. And he was laughing at it, but openly mocking it. Like, what evidence? Where's this evidence? But it was the way he did it was just so riddled with ego. I was like, well, how could you? First of all, the concept of 11,000 years ago, you start thinking about it's wrong. And what evidence really would be there other than stone? It seems to me that it would be very little. I mean, whatever fragments of pottery you'd be lucky to find. But looking for some massive evidence that clearly shows, beyond any shadow of doubt, well, here it is. Oh boy, you're asking for a lot from 11,000 years ago. You have something pretty substantial right in front of you, and he's mocking it.
Exactly. This is why I've come to view archaeology and history as a kind of more ideology, really, than science. There's an ideological view about how civilization developed, that we have this long, slow, gradual, politically correct rise from the Upper Paleolithic, from the hunter-gatherers through the Neolithic into the first cities, and on, and then we developed technologies, and here we are, the apex and the pinnacle of this whole story. And gosh, we're so proud of ourselves and our achievements, and we think we're wonderful, and we praise and value our technology. I've got nothing against it, but there's nothing of arrogance in this, of pride, that it was all about us. And I think that once you start introducing
Dude,
this
where you going?
new view of history, that there may have been an earlier civilization, a high civilization, which was utterly wiped out by a global cataclysm, why it contradicts that ideological position, and you find yourself in ideological struggle with archaeologists. And that's why, you know, so for example, if my book is handed over to any archaeologist to review, they're just going to piss all over it. They're not even probably going to read it. They're just going to say Hancock. They say again and again, Hancock is a pseudo-scientist. Nobody should listen to him. That's their system of attack, is to first of all devalue you so much that nobody will ever listen to you. And that's why I appreciate the support of just real down-to-earth people out there who are looking at this information and finding that actually, yeah, the story of history we've been taught doesn't make sense. And this new information does make sense.
Well, this new information, in my eyes, it seems it's so substantial, and there's so much of it, and it's so much of it fits together. It's incredibly difficult to ignore, and much more so than when that documentary of the Sphinx was created. That was quite a while ago. Charlton Heston was the narrator of it.
And at that time, we were sticking our necks out, putting that information forward. I was in that documentary as well.
Yeah.
But today, things have changed, and what I see is the archaeological mainstream in a state of denial about this information. They just don't want to recognize it and absorb it, but they're going to have to recognize it. It's going to be forced upon them, whether they like it or not.
It's so sad because you count on these people to distribute the information, but their egos get involved in things, and if you've been teaching something for a long time, then it turns out you gave out master's degrees to things that are completely incorrect. It's got to be very hard.
Something else, although this sounds a bit conspiratorial, I think the existing view of history is part of a mind control system in our society. It's something that we're presented with, that we take in with our mother's milk, and we're never supposed to question. I think it's, if you control, you do actually control the present and the future as well.
So, but you mean if you have an absolutely established narrative that you're teaching and you're unwilling to look at any possible variations of that, you're saying, like, almost from an authority position, we know what happened and we know where we're going. But if you say, shit, we don't know what happened, then it's, well, then who are you to tell us where we're going?
Exactly. And it starts to raise questions over everything, actually.
Right.
Yeah, and we're kind of in this mode now where there's a very large, growing political agenda around the idea that humans are the sole cause of global change, and that we're the dominant force within this whole process. Now here we come along and we're saying, well, no, there's actually been forces unleashed on this planet that really utterly dwarf anything we've done yet. What does that do to that area? You see, that's what I think we're going down here. Part of the scenario now is that humans are engaged in causing the 6th great mass extinction, as we talked about in one of the previous. And now we're coming along and saying, well, wait a second, here's something from outer space that has come in and caused the last great mass extinction on Earth. And what's interesting, I found, is that quite a number of the impact hypothesis have been in the forefront of pushing this scenario of human-caused mass extinction and blaming the extinction of the great megafauna that died out 12,000 years ago on human hunters, which, again, we talked about. 10 million woolly mammoths before they could even reach
mammals in North America were wiped out somewhere around that time.
Mega mammoths, which is over 100 pounds a bottom, essentially. Actually more, like 75%. 75%.
It was almost instantaneous, right? I mean, it was over a course of a very short period of time.
Very short period of time. The scientists who have been diligently working away in this field since they've published their first paper in 2007 have just brought out a new paper, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, July 2015, where they're doing a statistical analysis of all the sites where the evidence comes from. And what that tells us is that this is what is referred to as an isochrone. This event 12,800 years ago. We're not looking at the effects of 100 or 200 years of events. We're looking at something that happened effectively in a single across 50 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface.
Ooh, that gives me goosebumps. A single afternoon, all over the world, everything changes forever, and it's fucked for 1,000 years.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then I'd like Randall to address this issue of continent-wide wildfires, because we do see this in the stratum. When you get this ejecta coming down on ancient primal forests, consider the effect.
This is Murray Springs on the Clovis sites, and this is what is known as the black mat layer.
Where's Murray Springs?
It's in Arizona, and it's southern Arizona, and it's near the Clovis site, which is New Mexico.
That's the Clovis impact site?
Well, no, the Clovis site was where one of the first places in North America where human remains were found in association with extinct mega mammals, such as woolly mammoths. And it's just outside of Clovis, New Mexico.
They refer to them as the Clovis culture, and because that culture was one of the casualties of this comet impact, the comet impact is often referred to as the Clovis comet.
Yes. And many of these Clovis sites, and there's over 50 of them around now documented over North America, I think about 2/3 of them have this black mat layer that shows up very clearly in this image. The black mat layer is black because of the considerable amount of carbon soot. So in other words, right there, that's the evidence of this blanket of soot over the continent that left this black mat layer. And below that black mat layer, you'll find extinct megamammoths. Like here, you see the yellow arrow there points to the black mat layer. Now, if you look up, you'll see how it's more buff colored. That was the color of all of this, but the soot that was in that black mat layer dispersed and colored the other adjacent layers. But you'll notice the bones below are the bones of extinct mammals. The bones found above it are extinct or still existing mammals. These two domains, extinct mammals and extant mammals.
Just a very clear line.
Yeah, and you can see it shows up so clearly right.
To people who are listening to this, when we're looking at the original image that ran, it's almost like an Oreo cookie. Like there's just a clean line, and then there's a white filling underneath. It's clear as day. And what are we talking about? Like how much fire and for how long creates this area?
Well, basically, burning a considerable portion of the biomass of North America in unglaciated North America to do this. And it's
So you have the ice cap north of roughly Minnesota, and south of it you have a heavily vegetated
yes.
area covered with primal forests. And that's what goes on fire. The reason it goes on fire is because when these impactors come in, they generate a huge amount of heat, and what is called ejecta, superheated ejecta, is thrown up into the upper atmosphere, and it falls down all over the continent.
Oh, God.
Now at the base,
Perspective is so difficult in this. This is because there's numbers that you guys are throwing around and these concepts you're throwing around that I have to pause when you're saying, well, I gotta try to fit this in somewhere. It's the whole world on fire.
Yeah. This is why I've written this book, because it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling material. And up till now, most of the information has been confined to the really rarefied scientific journals. Very little of it has got out into the public. So one of the things I've tried to do is to put this together into a form that's very accessible to the general public. Because we all need to talk about this. This is our yesterday. This is where we come from. The present order of the world.
What is the mainstream explanation for what we're looking at here? Like how do they describe this?
well, the mainstream, to me now is Firestone.
Yeah, and when Randall says Firestone West, some of the lead scientists present the evidence because although they were something vicious and pregnant, defended themselves so well that they kept on bringing in new data and new information. Now, we should use that as the mainstream. There are a few critics still
the evidence of these woolly mammoths and they're massive. pieces point together, and including looking at this, it's just, this is blowing my mind. This idea of the world on fire.
Well, there were some places that apparently got spared.
Like Australia or something?
Well, Australia actually suffered a major mass extinction, probably from some previous event, maybe 30,000 years ago. But
I'm just trying to figure out where to go.
East Central
Like
Africa
Australia.
seems to have been one of the places of refuge, because if we look at the distribution of mega mammals in the world today, where do we find the greatest concentration? In Africa, right? Well, Africa has retained 90% of its mega mammals from the Pleistocene, whereas North America lost 75%. If you go back to North America during the Ice Age, there was as many mega mammals, if not more species, than there is in Africa today. But what we see is that extinction relates directly to habitat loss. And basically, not much survived in either North or South America. North and South America were both severely affected by these events and lost 75% of their mega mammals. Eurasia lost between, depending on where you go, between 30 and 50%. Africa only lost about 10% of them. And that's why you see so many big animals still in Africa today. And a lot of them, I think, probably dispersed from the area around the Great Rift Zone. It seems like in a lot of the areas actually where we're finding early hominids is in that same area. That seems like for whatever reason it was spared somewhat of the extreme severity that the rest of the planet suffered.
It's an interesting situation because when we look at the arguments of history and archaeology, very little of the story is told in North America, as it's taught in schools and universities today. You know, they look at places like Sumer in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, and further down in South America, some of the great cultures of the Andes. But it's like North America is missing from the map. They talk about hunter-gatherers coming in here across the Bering Strait, and there's still a dogged faction of archaeology that wants to maintain that just happened about 13,000 years ago. And that there was no human beings in the Americas before that, although the mass of contradictory evidence is overwhelming that dogma as well. It's obvious that the Americas were populated long before that, and those populations did not only come in across the Bering Strait, they came in other ways as well. And then there just seems to be nothing for a very long time. And North America's kind of left out of the story of civilization. Well, now I think we know why. Because North America was at the heart of this disaster. It was at the absolute epicenter, and the slate was completely wiped clean here. And that's what archaeologists are looking at. They're seeing a wiped clean slate, and they think they're seeing the beginning of something. Actually, they're not. They're seeing the movement on of something after a horrendous disaster.
Wow, it's so hard to wrap my mind around this idea that for literally 1,000 years, the Earth was just riddled with asteroidal impacts and fire and nuclear winter because of the dust and mass extinction of... It's so hard, the numbers that you're throwing around and the ideas behind it. It's very difficult for folks to...
Can I put something in there that brings it home, in a way? See, this event, 12,800 years ago, we know now it was caused by fragments of a very large comet, and the work suggests that that comet may have been more than 100 kilometers in diameter originally when it entered the inner solar system. See,
that's
comets,
like 62 miles, right?
Yeah,
Isn't that somewhere
a big old comet. And these comets, they come in from deep space.
How big was the one that killed the dinosaurs? Like 5 miles?
Well, that's thought to be 10 kilometers wide. That
6
object.
miles.
That object, 6 miles wide, and
10 times that big?
Yeah, these things come in from deep space. There are reservoirs of comets. There's a place that they call the Oort cloud, which is just so far away that it's almost impossible to imagine it. But it contains trillions of comets, and often they're in stable orbits. They're not coming into the inner solar system. But as the solar system orbits around the center of the galaxy, our galaxy is the Milky Way. And we are in orbit around the center of the galaxy. Our sun, our solar system, everything is in orbit around the center of the galaxy. And that orbit is not only in the plane of the galaxy. Imagine a dolphin diving up and down, coming out of the surface of the sea, descending below, rising up again. That's what the solar system is doing. And those passages through the galactic plane disturb the Oort cloud, and they send comets winging in to the inner solar system. Thank God for Jupiter. Jupiter, with its huge gravity, is the great protector of the Earth. We should all wake up every day and say, thank you, Jupiter.
Thank you, Jupiter.
That this doesn't happen too often, but every now and then a comet gets past Jupiter's guard and comes in and enters the inner solar system. And the calculations show this happened about 20,000 years ago, and that comet went into an orbit that crosses the orbit of the Earth twice a year. We are still crossing the orbit of that comet twice a year, and there is still a very disturbing amount of debris within it. It's called the Taurid meteor stream. We've actually just finished our latest passage through the Taurid meteor stream. The Earth passes through the Taurid meteor stream twice a year. It takes 12 days to pass through it because the Taurid meteor stream, more numbers, is 30 million kilometers wide, and we orbit at the rate of 2.5 million kilometers a day. So 12 days to pass through it, and in the last 11,000 or so years, we've been lucky. We've been passing through this 30 million mile wide stream. We've been passing through bits where there are just filaments of small debris. But the evidence is that it is actually full of large rocky debris, including one object that may be as much as 30 kilometers in diameter, sitting in that Taurid meteor stream. So it's like, I compare it to like strapping on a blindfold and crossing a 6-lane highway and just hoping that you don't get hit by a truck. You know, that's what it comes down to. And we've been lucky so far. Actually, the most recent definite impact from the Taurid meteor stream was in 1908, and that was in Russia, in Siberia. It's called the Tunguska event. As I said, there's 2 passages through the stream, one in June, end of June, early July, and one in November. And this was at the end of June. An object not very big, about 100 meters in diameter, came out of the Taurid meteor stream, entered the atmosphere of the Earth, and actually blew up in the sky. It was an airburst about 5 kilometers above the ground. It flattened 80 million trees across 2,000 square kilometers. I'm sorry, I keep using kilometers rather than miles. 2,000 square kilometers of the Earth's surface. That's an area about the size of the city of London. If that impact had happened over an inhabited area, hundreds of thousands of people would be killed. And we would all be paying much more attention to the Taurid meteor stream today than we are presently doing. We should be paying attention to it.
So we just got super lucky that it hit a very lightly populated area, and it didn't even hit. It blew up in the sky above it. Pull up, see if you can find some image of Tunguska, because it's pretty staggering. And it literally looks like there was like a matchstick forest that someone pushed over, like a series of dominoes or something.
Oh,
God.
Jamie pulled that one up.
Jamie's a wizard. Kids on the ball.
Yeah.
God.
You know, so here's the thing. We are still interacting with the debris of this comet that changed the world 12,800 years ago. It's not something remote and distant. It's part of our daily lives. And it is something we should be paying attention to. And a number of astronomers are very concerned about the Taurid meteor stream. Now, I don't want to be the one who goes around the world, you know, wearing the sandwich board, saying that doom is nigh.
Literally, the sky is falling.
Yeah. I don't want to be that. I don't want to manifest that. I don't want to bring that down. I actually want to say that there's something positive to say about this. We are almost certainly the first civilization that's ever existed on this planet that has the capacity to intervene in our cosmic environment, should we choose to do so. We can make sure that we are not the next lost civilization. We can make sure that life and light continue on this planet and that our story continues. But we need to pay attention to our cosmic environment. And a number of scientists are now saying the same thing, that it's irresponsible of us to pretend that impacts like this, they just happen every 100 million years. We don't need to worry about them. We are intimately connected with a force that can change life on Earth, and we have the power to do something about it. So I would suggest, instead of wasting, you know, trillions of dollars globally creating weapons of mass destruction to destroy one another and to manifest the hatred and fear and suspicion that are just whizzing around the world right now, we should be looking at a grand human project, a cooperative effort to make our cosmic environment safe. And we have the technology now. It's just a matter of choice. It's just a matter of budget. Trillions of dollars are spent on arms, and roughly $20 to $30 million is spent a year on so-called space watch. it's a ridiculous chump change, given the nature of the threat and the implications.
About the same as the cost to run one McDonald's restaurant for a year. We're spending on studying the cosmic environment in terms of threats.
That's a hilarious comparison. What a resourceful little freaky animal people are. If you really stop and think about it, almost wiped off the face of the planet, 10,000, 12,000 years ago, and then we reach a point where here we are in 2015, and through all these inventions, we're starting to rediscover what our history truly is, and rediscover the history of the Earth, and its interplay with all these cosmic forces.
Modern humans have now, 190,000?
Yeah, the earliest definite anatomical model human skeleton remains dating back about 196,000 years. There's some other reports of nothing before that. It doesn't mean that we're not anatomically modern. It may just mean that archaeologists haven't found the data yet. But we can be sure that people like you and me have been around for about 200 years. The anatomically modern form and the anatomically modern brain. So there's a mystery right there. Why did we wait 190,000 years to establish the first civilization? It raises the possibility that we could have done so much earlier, and that the slate is quite clear.
Think about it this way, Joe. My grandfather was born in 1895. The main mode of transportation, aside from railroads at that time, was horseback, right? His grandfather, would have been born pre-Civil War. So in 5 generations, we've gone from the very first railroads, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, to where we are now, in 5 generations. Now, if you go back 200,000 years, say 196,000, and we divide that by 25,
I love when Miranda breaks out.
we're looking at almost 8,000 generations of humans.
Wow.
Now think about that. Within 5 generations, we've gone from 90% dominant, agriculturally based, subsistence farming, right, feudal system, to where we are now. But now we've got 8,000 generations of humans on this planet. Who knows what we may have accomplished in the past? But once you put this perspective, and you got to understand that the catastrophe we're talking about 12,000 years ago, while all the evidence suggests it was the most severe, probably at least within 5 million years, because the last time we can find a species loss equivalent to the terminal Pleistocene species loss was 5 million years ago, the Hemphillian event it's called, which then I would then consider that again as a measuring stick for habitat loss, which would in turn be a measure of the severity of whatever happened. But the point is that in the time that we humans have been around, there have been multiple catastrophes of a global scale, not as severe as the one we're talking about here, but certainly the framework of this planet has been shaped numerous times. And in 200,000 years, we've had probably 4 great glacial cycles that have come and gone. Now, just a glacial cycle alone, I mean, think about that, what the ice will do to the landscape, and dropping sea levels 400 feet. And now during an ice age, you've got to bear in mind that probably the most habitable place to be on the planet is going to be on coastlines, along the mouths of rivers and so forth. What happens when all that ice melts and sea level comes up 300 or 400 feet? And it's going to pretty much erase most of the evidence of human habitation. Although, and I think I talked about this last time, you would probably concur with this, marine archaeology.
It's extremely important. But again, unfortunately, marine archaeology has its eye off the ball. Most of the resources in marine archaeology go into shipwreck, looking for shipwrecks. And I get that. It's really interesting to look at shipwrecks, but there is a prejudice in archaeology which says there could have been no interesting civilization before 12,000 years ago. So since those lands that were submerged by rising sea levels have been underwater for 10 or 12,000 years, we're not really interested in human habitations there. And this is the problem. A very focused effort needs to be made to look at these lost lands. I can put that in miles. 10 million square miles of the Earth's surface, roughly Europe and China added together, was submerged by the rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age.
Jesus Christ.
That's what's missing from the record, And again, we're talking about wiping the slate clean, and Randall's right. Those ice caps that sit on top of a continent, which are mountain high, they're going to just grind to powder anything that lies below them. So was there a civilization there before where the ice cap formed? Who knows?
Right.
A mile high of ice.
Yeah.
Or even more than that in some cases. Over central Canada, it might have been as much as 2 miles.
2 miles.
2 miles of
ice. Just pushing across the ground like an eraser.
Exactly.
Just
Yeah,
wiping
in
everything
crushing the surface of the ground down, I think in our discussions of Atlantis we covered that a little bit. Crushing the surface of the land down by perhaps a couple of thousand feet. Isostatic depression. You remember the geology lesson I gave you last time?
Yes.
About isostatic depression, and we
Yes.
discussed how at this very moment your ass is demonstrating an important geological phenomena of isostatic depression sitting on that cushion that you're sitting on. And if you were to stand up, what happens when you stand up? The cushion comes back up, doesn't it? It's exactly what happens, and you can almost picture the planet breathing in effect. The ice is released from the continental surface. The continental surface begins to rebound. The weight is transferred back into the ocean basins, and there has to be what's called rheology, which is the study of the distribution of the inner mass of the Earth, requires that there be compensation. So if in one area of the surface the land is rising, somewhere else it has to be subsiding. And the obvious place would be that as you transfer the weight from the continent back into the ocean basins, that the ocean basins are going to subside. And this brings us, to the whole question of the scientific veracity of a sunken landmass.
I think you have an interesting point on the Azores in this sense, because there you have this massive weight. It's like a seesaw. There you have this massive weight pressing down on the North American continent, and suddenly it's lifted. That massive weight pushed down North America, but it lifted up other areas, the other end of the seesaw. Then the weight comes off, this end goes up, and the other end goes down. And suddenly you get the possibility of the submergence of a landmass. It just falls under the sea.
And there is actually considerable empirical evidence suggesting that there was massive post-glacial subsidence along the mid-Atlantic ridge.
Which is where the Azores are.
Yeah. And which is pretty much where Plato
said Atlantis was.
Yeah.
Wasn't there some discovery of some concentric circles that were submerged somewhere near Spain that they considered to be a possibility?
Yeah, that's
of
off
Atlantis?
Cadiz. I don't think
Is that near Spain?
Yeah, it's. I think it's much more recent.
Okay.
Much more recent than the information we're looking at. But,
So
but ice sheets in the UK were on the. Then when you take those ice sheets off, the southern part starts to go down, so that's places like the Isle of Wight and the English Channel. They're sinking beneath the sea because of this. Still, the effect of that rebound is happening today.
That's called the glacial forebulge, where outside the
have a hard time accepting some of this new information. I have a friend who's a scientist, and the last time you were on, she said to me, "Did you have a climate denier on your show? A climate change denier?" And I said, "He's definitely not denying it."
no.
Yeah.
But some people, that's all they hear when you bring forth a non-mainstream point of view or a controversial perspective. Instead of considering the possibility, it almost immediately gets dismissed as.
Well, this climate change thing is another ideological problem. Yeah, sure, climate change is but what are the causes for this? I'm so sure that it's all caused by human beings. I would say there's very good reason for humanity to clean up our act in lots of ways, regardless of the issue of climate change. We're abusing Mother Earth. We're living upon this planet like parasites and destroying it. We thoughtlessly created gigantic pools of pollution. We're crazy enough, insane enough to actually invent nuclear weapons and to detonate them. There's lots about our behavior that we need to fix because it's right to fix it. Philosophically right. We should not behave that way. We should behave that way to one another. We should not behave that way to planet Earth. To say that we need to fix our behavior because of global warming, that's an ideological argument. And that argument remains to be properly tested. Yes, global warming is real. Or is something else, some grander scale cosmic effect.
people, you know, not liking the idea that I could question the dog. But there are some facts that you can't say. No, the global warming began 200 years ago. And we see that the glaciers from the Little Ice Age began to shrink back in the early 19th century. Before there was, you know, a century before there was any significant human contribution of CO2 to the atmosphere. So something was driving the warming that began. And it's important to realize that the Little Ice Age was probably the coldest period since the end of the Great Ice Age. In fact, the data overwhelmingly supports that, and that the glaciers grew to their largest extent around the planet in 10,000 years. So when we're talking about glacier recession, it's important to understand what the baseline is. Our baseline in this case is the biggest the glaciers have been in 10,000 years. And what's interesting, this is going on right now, as the glaciers have been receding, geologists and biologists and glaciologists and so forth have been studying the landscapes that are being revealed as the ice shrinks back. And you know what they're finding is the remains of forests that had been overrun up, you know, and peat things that from roughly 1400 to 1800 were actually forests, because the ice came down and overran these forests, and now it's receding back and revealing that there were forests there. So that tells you that, you know, at some point, probably going back to the medieval warm period, those areas that have been glaciated during the early part of the 20th century were actually free of ice. And so, you know, the climate has been extremely dynamic. That's the thing we have to emphasize, all by itself, without any help from humans. And this is what I'm saying, is that we have to look at that and realize that humans are a factor. You know, somebody I did post and said all the other factors I had mentioned, as, you know, ocean currents and wind currents and geomagnetic field and cosmic rays and volcanism and all that, it all been investigated and dismissed. The only thing left was the human contribution. But, you know, to me, that's really, we're putting all our eggs in that basket, and that could turn out to be very dangerous, because we're so focused now on our own contribution that we might be overlooking the fact that there have been natural factors driving climate change over and over and over again. I mean, because I still what caused and come back out of this. And I think that what bringing back presents a possible solution to what could have brought this ice age scale. And the other point I think I'd like to make is that we have to really, to understand our planet as a system, we have to realize that it's part of a cosmic ecosystem. And the cosmos has been a much bigger player in what's been going on down here than has been previously understood or appreciated. Yeah. And I think our ancestors probably did understand
they did understand it.
Yes.
The focus on the skies, if you go back in ancient times, is so strong. This notion of as above, so below, that we are connected to the cosmos. This is something that we're tending to forget in the modern world, again, because we're so puffed up with pride. Anyway, we can't see the sky if we live in cities.
That's, I think, a big issue.
Yeah, light pollution. It's just like a haze up there. We don't see anything. So we're actually cut off from the cosmos psychologically, and that's a mistake, because we are part of this giant cosmic environment, and it affects us. And one of the way it affects us is the way that comets come into the inner solar system from time to time from deep space.
I was camping in Montana recently, and you know, when you're out at night and you look at that night sky and there's no light pollution, it's just a totally different perspective,
isn't it?
And it gives you a different sense of where you are in the universe, because we're so, and it's not necessarily our fault. It's almost like we've put up a curtain over the heavens, and we can't see through the curtain because we've decided that we like light, and we like traffic lights, and, you know, building lights and all this jazz, and we don't realize until we're out in the woods or in the wild, until you're in the wilderness and there's no light pollution, you really don't realize what we're missing and what we're sacrificing in order to have these lights.
Definitely.
The view of the heavens It's psychedelic in a way.
You bet.
Because it makes you feel like, oh my God, we're really flying through space.
Yeah, and nice that Mother Nature has provided us with those plants that really help us to appreciate it from time
I
to
try
time.
to go every year to the Keck Observatory on the Big Island. I try to schedule my holidays as much as possible around the time where there's no moon, because it is unbelievable. Because the Keck Observatory is more than 9,000 feet above sea level. There's the visitor center, and then there's the observatories above, but you really don't even have to go past the visitor center. But they're, the way they have it set up, they have these special street lights all throughout the Big Island with diffused lighting, so it doesn't interfere, it doesn't give you light pollution. And when you're up there, you go through the clouds, and the view is insane.
I've never
it doesn't,
been. I'd
it
love
doesn't
to
even
go.
look real.
Yeah.
It doesn't even look real. Like, you see all the stars, you're like, this can't be real. How could this be up there every day and we don't see it? But what we've done is create all this incredible stuff. These streets and buildings and laptops and cell phones, and in doing so, we've robbed ourselves of perspective.
Yeah, it is weird because, you know, we have this technology that enables us to go around the whole world and even go out into outer space, but actually in a way it's narrowed our focus. We focus in on the technology and its products, and we forget about the majestic cosmic and Earth environment in which we live, how sacred it is, how beautiful it is, how meaningful.
And that was the image that our ancestors always had. And that's
night.
probably why they concentrated on it so much.
And the things that happened up there were evident to them. I mean, because these days, how many people see meteors? Living in an urban environment, you never see them hardly, unless it's really spectacular. But you go out, like you said, in Montana, or one of my favorite places to go out into high desert country. And there you really, it's up, stars almost, you can reach out and touch it. I think that one of the most important things that we could do for future generations is part of our educational curriculum for young people is get them out of the cities, into nature, into the tremendous, you know, where they can actually see the sky. Because, I mean, living in Atlanta, I'll talk to people, even grown-up people that have no clue, You know, they couldn't find the North Star, they couldn't find the plane of the ecliptic if their life depended on it. We've become cut off from that level, and I think it's important for us to keep that, because our consciousness is linked to this greater domain, and we have segregated ourselves from that. And I think that there's something, amazingly, it's a grounding experience when you get out and you begin to see the sky, and you can actually you begin to figure out and identify the constellations, to know where the planets are, to look in the sky. And
It's really good mental exercise.
It is.
Something worth anybody doing. Get to grips with all that up there, as the ancients did. It gets your mind working, and it may even have been used deliberately for that purpose in ancient times, a kind of initiation system. If you can get this, then you move on to the next level. You know, that's the kind of idea.
It was a critical part of education where it's very rarely even discussed today. Astronomy
Rarely discussed
is
today.
so...
Right.
And look again at the ideology. So, for example, talk about astrology to any mainstream scientist, they're going to laugh in your face.
Right.
They're going to say pseudoscience, because they're so locked into this Earth-centered perspective that which convinces them that the cosmos does have no effect on us. So how can changing patterns of the stars, which zodiacal affect us? I don't think we should throw that baby out with the bathwater too fast. I think we're looking at ancient science with astrology. It's been heavily diluted and prostituted. But if you go back to the antiquity, you go back to the real origins of this, and you start finding some very interesting information coming out. There's a fantastic book by Khan, Cosmos. A real mainstream, a very major academic, and he's got into this, and he's shown that, yeah, astrology does have effects. So we should not deny our cosmic environment. That's the first thing we need to connect with, and we shouldn't close ourselves off to avenues of inquiry. for ideological reasons. It's noticeable in this field of ancient history. Throw around words like pseudo-archaeologist or pseudo-scientist. That's meant to be an instant dismissal, just like climate denial. Climate denial. You call somebody a climate denier today, that's like saying, don't listen to anything that guy has to say. Never listen to it again. These are ideological tools which are being used to straitjacket the human mind and to stop us thinking outside the box. And if there's ever a time when we need to think outside the box, I would say
Isn't it ironic that in this time of more information available to the average person than ever before, that this also does coincide with our lack of appreciation of what's above us? It's very strange that...
it's a very curious phenomenon.
Yeah.
And here's an interesting perspective. You know, as we're talking about how dynamic the planet is and how it's changed and how dramatically different, which it is. I mean, if we go back to the end of the Ice Age, you know, go east of here, out in the Mojave Desert, that was lush grasslands and forests. You go out here to the Santa Rosa Islands, you know, out here, they were all forested with oak trees and beech trees and Mammuthus exilis, which was the pygmy mammoth. You know, I mean, everything down here changes dramatically. But when we go out and we look at the sky, we're basically seeing the same sky that our ancestors of 20,000 years ago were looking at. And that's something to keep in mind, because there's a backdrop to all of this drama and change here below that's pretty much, for the most part, remained consistent. But within that backdrop of consistency, every once in a while, something shifts. And when it shifts out there, I think our ancestors knew that there was a direct consequence here below. And that's one of the reasons they were so obsessed with being able to track motion. You know, all of these ancient observatories, from Stonehenge on down the line to, you know, the mound structures here in North America.
And let's not forget Göbekli Tepe, a profoundly astronomical site.
Göbekli Tepe, yes, these were astronomical observatories, using the horizon essentially as a telescope, by which very intimate and intricate movements within that backdrop of fixed stars could actually be observed, possibly for predictive capabilities.
And how are the calculations made? Like when an archaeologist finds a site like Göbekli Tepe, how do they correlate the construction of the site with the constellation?
Well, first off, most archaeologists don't do that at all, because they just don't do astronomy. They don't get it. Their eyes are on the ground at their feet.
Right, two different disciplines.
Because astronomy is not relevant to them, they project that onto the past and imagine that it's not relevant to the past. And that's one of the big mistakes, I think, that archaeology makes. There are people called archaeoastronomers who are looking at the astronomy of ancient cultures, and some of them have done very good work. But really, there are certain key indicators. The alignment of the sun. What's it pointing at? And does that alignment change down the ages? You can sometimes establish that a particular axis of a particular temple in Egypt, for example, was shifted over a period of 2,000 or 3,000 years several times. And why? Because they were tracking the changing rising point of the star Sirius, which they connected in their system. And that, since the Earth is our viewing, changes of orientation of the Earth in space do change. And this was clearly tracked by the ancients. Absolutely sure that astronomers were involved. If it's tracking the rising sun on the spring equinox,
Well, that's one of those. Which is what it was, a 26,000 year cycle.
26,000 year cycle, 25,920 years.
How did
very long, very precise observations, and the motive to make those observations, that this was important to them, and they sought to pass down that importance to us. Very important work by two historians of science called George and back in the 60s. They wrote a book called Hammer, which tracks this ancient knowledge of precision. And they trace it back, and this was very politically incorrect at the time, because Giorgio de Santillana was the professor of the history of science at MIT. They trace it back to what they call some almost unbelievable civilization. that they found the data encoded in myths and traditions all around the world. Now, to go into it, they found it encoded as though the data were so important that it had to be passed down to the future. So the numbers relate to the equinox, they're all based on the number 72 and multiples of that number. Why? Because it takes 72 years for 1 degree of precessional change to unfold. And that's like holding your finger up to the horizon. That 1 degree is just that 1 finger width of change on the horizon. Very precise observations are needed to do it. It's encoded in myths and traditions. At some point decided this information is so important we must make sure that it stays permanently in human culture. So what we're going to do is we're going to encode great stories. And those stories can then be passed on by storytellers who will have an ethic that they must tell the story true. It doesn't matter whether they understand the scientific information in the story or not. All that matters is the oldest scientific knowledge of the phenomenon that we call the precession.
Which is referred to by
the full cycle, 25,000 miles, great circle. It's very evident if you've got thousands of years to watch the sky. It's very evident at the pole. Our pole star present is Polaris. That's just simply because the extended north pole of the Earth points most directly at that particular star in the sky. But it hasn't always pointed at Polaris because of the water. And it won't always point at Polaris because the pole star changes. You need to observe the skies for very long periods of time, keep detailed records to get to grips with this phenomenon. This therefore testifies to the fact that some ancient culture was doing this in a very systematic way. It's like a ghostly account of an advanced science impressed
I'm sorry. Has it been accepted that things like the Mayan temples were built in premier constellations? Is that accepted?
It's been accepted, yeah. It is accepted because we know that the Maya were an astronomical culture, and it is accepted that they were building their temples in connection to the sky. And the whole phenomenon of the Mayan calendar, which we all heard about in 2012. Is another factor to take into account. The Mayan calendar, in my view, is another artifact of the lost civilization. This is that was handed down from a former people, perhaps to the Olmecs, and then to the Maya, who succeeded them. It's accepted, but the implications of it are not taken properly into account. Remember 21st of December 2012. There was all that classic nonsense about the end of the world happening then, and it didn't. But the Maya never said that. They said that the end of a great cycle happened then, which would ultimately transform the world. But what it was actually locked into, and I need to pay tribute to another researcher here. His name is John Major Jenkins. John Major Jenkins has done fantastic work on the Mayan calendar, and decade before 2012 he was telling people, look, this is not talking about the end of the world on a specific day, on the 21st of December 2012. There's a calculation behind this, and what he showed in that calculation is that it is the position of the winter solstice sun against the background of the constellations. And what has been happening for the last 5,000 years because of precession is that the winter solstice sun, 21st of December, against the background of the constellations, has been gradually shifting towards alignment with the center of the galaxy. And that alignment happened on the 21st of December 2012, but it's not an instant, it's a window. And that window is about 80 years wide, roughly from 1960 to 2040. That was a calendar that can predict eclipses of the moon 200,000 years into the future, 200,000 years into the past. Incredible, stunning accuracy, a better estimate of the length of the solar year than we use today in our modern calculations.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
High science encoded in that calendar.
Why don't we just adopt the Mayan calendar? If it's better than what we have, I don't.
Yeah, we're now living in the 5th age of the world, according to the Mayan.
For day-to-day use.
Probably not good for your iPhone. Wouldn't make a good app. I bet they have a Mayan calendar.
I bet they have a Mayan calendar app.
I'm sure they do.
You can think of one half of a degree. Graham said 1 degree every 72 years, right? 1 degree within the great year is like 1 day out of the great year, right? So you could think of 72 years as basically being a human life. So an average human life is roughly like a day of the great year. Like yeah. Now, what he said about the window is because you can't define the center of the galaxy with an exact precise point. There's a diffuse area there, and every 72 years, the spring point is moving 1 degree, which is twice the diameter of a full moon. Full moon is half a degree, right?
Okay.
And I think that possibly one of the importances of monitoring, because you can't really, you can't go out and look at the sun, and say, okay, here's the sun relative to this backdrop of this constellation. However, you can look at a full lunar eclipse, and then you will know that the sun is 180 degrees around. So by monitoring lunar eclipses, you can actually position the sun quite precisely and know where it is in the sky, because obviously you can't go out and look at the sun and see what stars it's related to.
Right.
But during a lunar eclipse,
right.
It's 180 degrees, almost precisely on the other side of the Earth from the sun.
So
can I just jump in for a second, because I have an image here. I don't know if we can
go
get it
back
on.
to tap it.
And it's this image on this side. It's a pillar richly carved, showing a.
Is that pillar 14?
That's
is that
pillar
what
43.
43.
In enclosure D. Now I'm not going to go into it in detail now.
I've seen that online, but Jamie will find images online.
I just want to make the point, and I go into this in this book, Magicians of the Gods, that is to be a diagram of the sky, the solstice in our epoch. The round dot above the vulture's wing, the round circle, represents the sun. And what we're looking at is an ancient constellation diagram. The constellations that we call Sagittarius stand on the side of the galactic center, of the dark rift at the heart of the Milky Way, which the Maya saw as the womb of cosmic rebirth. And it's precisely that image that is depicted there. I back it up chapter and verse in there. Just have to take
Is
the
that
word
what
for
we
it at
see,
the
the
moment.
scorpion below? Is
Yeah,
that-
there's an ancient memory that there should be a scorpion in the area of this pillar.
And what are the...
Outstretched and
Yes.
the sun over the wing. Then go on, you see a bird. Underneath the pillar, but go above. There's a serpent there. Beside it, another. Those represent. We call those.
Yours maybe.
We call those constellations today Ophiuchus, the serpent holder, which is represented by the bird there, and we call the serpent constellation Serpens. Other constellations are also involved. This is spooky and eerie. Because it appears there's overwhelming evidence that the people who made Göbekli Tepe had a profound knowledge of precession, and it appears that they deliberately sent forward into time in this time capsule a picture of the star now. That is a staggering possibility that I investigate.
I don't
here.
understand how it's in our age.
Well, it's only at the winter solstice in our age that the sun sits over the center of the galaxy. The winter solstice, in the area that the ancient Maya called the cosmic womb. There's a dark rift in the Milky Way at that point, and they saw that as the cosmic womb. So it symbolizes a moment of rebirth. And the evidence is that they've been tracking the movement of the sun on the winter solstice, which is also the end of the year and the rebirth of the new year. They've been tracking it to the point where they could project forward and they could envisage the sky in our epoch today. The Maya could do that, and what I'm suggesting is that's done at Göbekli Tepe as well.
Wow, it's very hard for me to interpret this. I'm seeing the vulture playing basketball, trying to get away from the scorpion, and just trying to attack him.
Yeah,
And I'm not exactly sure.
No, the photograph alone, that's just the heart of the mystery.
Right.
You have to get into the logic of it and compare it with the existing constellations, and I've tried to do that.
Well, it's also fascinating that all of these images were carved in 3D relief. So instead of being, what that means is instead of being drawn like into, like, you know, people think about like wet cement, you can draw your name in wet cement. Instead of that, what they've done is they've removed everything around it to create these images, which is a much more sophisticated way.
This is what's called high relief. Interestingly, you can see at the top of the pillar there are three that look things that look like handbags. That symbol crops up all over the world. It crops up in Mexico, it crops up in Mesopotamia, it crops up in India, everywhere. And again, I think we're looking at this symbolism that goes back to very period.
Maybe what they're trying to say is they're shopping to the end of us all.
I think there's really, and I'm asking, because this is another issue that is ignored by the mainstream, is the use of psychedelics in ancient civilizations was fundamental. This is another area where they don't want ancient cultures to look like them. They just ignore the evidence.
I think it's one of the main points of view that when you don't consider that, it makes me really reluctant to listen to a lot of the other things we said, because it's undeniable that we have those. And it's also undeniable that many, many, many civilizations use them as a part of their spiritual ritual. And the fact that this is not thought of as an important aspect of history, when all it means to me is the people that are talking about have experience.
Exactly, that's the problem. The archaeologists who are entrusted with interpreting our past to us. Unfortunately, most of them have never taken psychedelic in their life, so they don't know what the experience is.
Look, I just need 15 minutes of your time. One DM teacher, 15 minutes, and the whole thing will be so much clearer. So
exactly. For archaeologists, because it was a universal experience in the ancient world. We demonize totally negative things, but in the ancient world they were revered and enshrined. They were at the heart of the ancient mysteries. The Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece used a potion related to LSD, which brought about a revelation for the initiates, changed their lives, just in the way that a powerful psychedelic trip can change our lives today. So just like writing about history and the origins of civilization without taking account of this gigantic cataclysm 12,800 years ago, that's a mistake that archaeologists are making. The other mistake they're making is they're not considering the role of altered states of consciousness in ancient civilizations.
I don't know whether or not that's like the same shop. Malls will ruin us all.
But the weird thing is that it's all that this symbolism is I have something there.
The symbolism of these persons.
Yes. All over the world. For example, I think we can find an image, but there's the earliest image of the figure known as Quetzalcoatl in Mexico. Survives from the old area it was found in a site called La Peña, along with a lot of other buried skeletons. It shows a man sitting within the coil of a serpent. That serpent has a crest on its head, because that's what Quetzalcoatl means. It means a feathered serpent. And that man is holding one of those bags, just the same as the...
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
The Sumerian tradition.
The Oannes, the Uanadana, the originator of civilization in Sumer, ancient Sumer, according to he's always the one. So I find myself wondering, are we looking at the symbolism of some ancient brotherhood who passed around the world, seeding civilizations, and that this was the equivalent of their, I don't know, their Masonic handshake or something. This was their badge of recognition, this bag that they carried.
Well, it's just speculation, right?
It's pure
fun.
speculation.
It's interesting.
It's pure speculation.
But so because of the fact that they've accepted that the Mayan temples are aligned with the constellations, have they decided to look at other archaeological discoveries in this
As I say, there is a specialized subdivision of astronomers.
An accepted subdivision.
It's an accepted subdivision. These are archaeologists who've been trained in astronomy, but they've also been trained in the fundamental dogmas of the discipline of archaeology, which is that there can be no lost civilization, that archaeology has already told pretty much the full story of humanity, and that all that awaits is to fill in the details. This is the dogma of archaeology that is taken in from the moment that somebody decides to become an archaeologist, part of the training. And actually, if you try and go against that dogma as a mainstream archaeologist, you can kiss goodbye to your career. Any archaeologist who entertains the possibility of an advanced lost civilization around the world more than 12,000 years ago will have no future as an archaeologist. That's right there, you're right for the rest of his career.
It's so disturbing. It's so disturbing. If that's true, it's so blinding. Why would you ever believe that we've got it all figured out, where every day they'd find some new stuff? Did you see the discovery we found recently of a large tooth that's a cousin of human beings? Yeah, just really recently, within the last few days.
Very, very recently. That's the thing, you see. Our story is much more complex than we've been taught. And gradually, bit by bit, the evidence is coming out of the woodwork.
Well, the idea that we have all the data of history is just so crazy. It's just not true.
And arrogant.
It's absolutely foolish.
Yeah, it's a very foolish idea, and it shuts us down to the possibilities. I mean, the universe gifted us with these giant brains and this incredible imagination and intuitive faculties as well. We're not only rational creatures, we're intuitive creatures. And all of information in dreams. When knowledge in dream was revealed things have changed.
There's so much less information. It means that you're we've already discovered.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Again, it's ideology. It's saying that there is nothing about you. How do we know? The ancient world felt that there was useful knowledge. Gate of ivory. Some dreams come through the gate of ivory. They're just pleasant and this was a recognized fact. Pseudoscience, it's regarded as nonsense. Again, that label is constantly applied to anything else. Pseudoscience. Right there with the label, they just dismiss everything. They always call me pseudoscience, which means a false scientist. Because I'm not a scientist at all. I've never claimed to be a scientist. I don't want to be a scientist. I'm a writer. I'm a journalist. I synthesize material. There's a broad range of disciplines. So how can I be a false scientist? The word is used as a club. Beat an enemy over the head and ensure that nobody listens to that enemy.
This is sort of a bulletproof majority. But it's got to be satisfying to you going from that fascinated by fingerprints of the gods to slowly but surely over time more and more evidence being discovered in mainstream science and archaeology confirms all these suspicions. And then attached to what Randall has been studying his whole life, it really, the whole thing just sort of unfolds in front of your eyes.
There's a kind of perfect moment in human knowledge unfolding right now. We now have the knowledge of this giant cataclysm that happened 12,800 years ago, which has just not been taken into account at all up to now. And at the same time, and it's almost eerie, archaeological sites are popping up all around the world that cannot be explained by the previous model of history.
Now, with all of this information that you've shown so far, the layer that shows the massive burning of the forest, the impact craters that we found, the nuclear glass, the micro diamonds, all this evidence, the immediate shift of the climate, the mass extinction of a huge percentage of the large mammals, is the impact period, is that considered in mainstream science?
Not
or
yet.
Have they just,
it's
are they
considered
disputing
in
that?
mainstream science because it's mainstream scientists who presented the evidence.
All the data you've accumulated in
It all comes from mainstream science. Absolutely leading scientific journal.
But you're stitching it together.
What nobody has done yet, I think I'm probably the first person to do it, is to take that evidence and consider its implications for the stories we tell ourselves about the origins of civilization. Very important story. Where did civilization come from? What is it? And that information has not been taken into account at all by archaeologists yet. I hope they will do so in the future. They need to play a very fast game of catch-up to catch up with the science on this and take it into account. But right now, it's not being taken into account at all. You will not find a single archaeological document which takes account of the cataclysm that happened between 12,000 years.
A big part of the problem is specialization in science, I think. So you've got, paleontologists looking at the extinction events. You've got, marine geologists looking at sea level rise. You've got glaciologists looking at how the glaciers disappeared. And we're in a position now where we need to begin synthesizing all of this. What's interesting to me, though, is that it almost falls on the shoulders of the mammals, the synthesizers. And that's kind of really, right now, there's so much specialization in science that the next phase of it, I think, is beginning to integrate it, to create a coherent model of our past. Because a lot of, like Graham is saying, a lot of the mainstream scientists have this information, right? If we look at this graph right here, and you see how this compares with the graphs we just saw of the climate changes and the ocean level. This is, as it says, late Pleistocene mortality. And this is basically looking at radiocarbon-dated fossilized remains of the extinct mammals. If you look carefully, you'll see that within the range that we're talking about right here, here's your 13,000 year cycle.
It's exactly the same time period, and exactly the same as the changing of the temperature, the rising of the sea levels, massive extinction.
Right, and there it is right there. Every one of these squares represents a fossilized remain. 360 or 70 specimens that have been...
It seems insanely unlikely to me that this didn't correspond with an impact on human civilization.
It's very clear that it
it's
did.
insane. It seems insane that it's not like mainstream and ever did. This is all fact, and obviously it is. How is this not like? How is this so glaring?
There's something. It raises horrible possibilities that they have completely about the origins of science. I mean, not just slightly wrong, but completely wrong. That's a horrible possibility. It's much better to just try to do it. I'm not saying that it's a conspiracy by archaeologists. I'm saying it's if you're invested in a system of ideas, so powerfully invested in your own personality, you just can't accept it. It's really hard to accept. Almost your generation needs to die off before a new generation comes prepared to do it. Just with old age, I'm not threatening.
No,
I'm not threatening an assault on the world of archaeology.
No, you're not.
But
I do because it impacts.
yeah. And that's, I think that's the problem. Randall's right. One of the problems is the intense specialization of our society. That's one of the strengths of it. It's also one of the weaknesses. Everybody's really good at one particular thing.
That's the only way it all works out. That's no one would possibly get all this work done.
And they're all interdependent upon one another, but there's not enough comparing notes across the disciplines. And I guess that's where my skills, such as they are, come in. I spent my whole life synthesizing data from many different fields.
And also, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like part of the issue is there's no consequence to not accepting this. There's no consequence to just ignoring it. They ignore it, they teach what they taught not mainstream, and they still come out smelling like the rose. It looks great. Exactly.
They all keep their job.
Yes.
It's
They
really
don't annoy their colleagues.
It's almost the opposite. Because to go here, they're actually they're threatening their position. You know, they're putting their position in danger.
But I don't understand why they would be, because to me it seems like you would want to say, we have some exciting new data. So this is, now we have to reconsider what we already know.
Yeah.
You know, we already know, about this part of the world, this is what we already know about the Pleistocene era, we already know about all these different eras, but now we have this new data to consider. Here all it is.
They should be excited about it. They should be joyous that
Yes.
there's something here which really changes. That's not
I mean, it's really unfortunate, but it really does.
You see, this is an area that Randall and I happen to know a lot about. What I wonder is, in other areas that I don't know about, is this same phenomenon at work?
Right.
The kind of knowledge filter, which is
Like,
just shutting us off.
In
From
what discipline would that be? Or are you just speculating?
social sciences,
Right.
any area of science, medicine, how things are to be done with medicine, how tumors are to be handled and dealt with. You know, we have a dogma right now that it's chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and every other system is regarded as what? Pseudoscience generally. But maybe that's a mistake. You know, considering the possibility of these alternative therapies, maybe they're better than blasting somebody with highly radioactive material.
Well, I certainly think there's some things that we don't know about the impact of nutrition and overall health and medication and just the impact of stress and well-being and how it plays on different factors. And I think we're going to learn all that. I mean, I think there's probably more discussion and more focus on that than there is on stuff like this.
Sure there is. Our personal health is important to all of us. And
this is it's kind of a part of our personal health,
you
too.
bet it is, yeah.
It's a part of our understanding of the very environment that we exist in.
Where we came from, yeah, absolutely.
Now, how long did you guys road trip together?
It's about 2 weeks, wasn't it,
A little shy of 2 weeks.
And what did it entail? Did you guys make a video of it or anything?
There was a lot of video shot, and
Beautiful.
One of Randall's colleagues, Brad, who was with us, shot video along the way, and my wife Sandra took photographs, and you know we've documented all of this very thoroughly. But it was an amazing road trip for me. It was the first time actually I've driven a great distance across the continental United States. I've always been in this city or that city and picking up an airplane and going here, but actually drive across this incredible, majestic land. Was an enormous experience for me. It filled me with a sense of just how huge America is. I live in this tiny island, you know, Britain, but this giant, the open skies country that they call it. It was a great initiation into a beautiful part of North America and a mysterious part of North America. And it was great to do it with Randall. Because he's been walking the walk in this area for decades, and he knows that landscape on the back of his hand.
Yeah, and for people that are listening to this podcast right now, and this is your first introduction to Randall and Graham, you've got to go pause right now and go back to the first one Graham was on, the first one Randall was on. Just do a binge. Just binge listen or binge watch. What are we looking at here?
Well, this is Graham trespassing.
How dare you?
I'm watching in all directions.
You're not supposed to be there?
No.
Well, since the first time I was there, Graham actually referred to this erratic earlier. This was one of those.
This is that 18,000-ton boulder sitting above Wenatchee.
So that was the boulder that was pushed by the water?
It was carried aboard an iceberg.
Yeah. Chained in ice.
An iceberg.
Yeah.
So
An
berg
iceberg.
that was this massive rush of water had giant rocks embedded in the iceberg.
Yeah, and to float that, you need an iceberg about the size of an oil tank.
Yes, and this is sitting 400 feet above the modern day Columbia. So we know that the water was at least this high. Well, actually, it had to have been higher than this because 90% of the iceberg is under the surface of the water.
And how do we know that this rock just wasn't there? How do we know that it was carried by this?
Well, because it's not part of the bedrock. It's sitting on top of the land surface. Like all of these. If we look here, we've got some other.
Do we know where it came from? Do we know how far away it originated?
It's probably come from about 50 miles to 75 miles north of here. It's the type of basalt it has been identified. I don't remember specifically, but when you travel over this land, you see these giant boulders just strewn about.
There's a place called Boulder Park. It's a tourist attraction now. You can go see it.
Yeah. And you can see there, I mean, the size of that. And there's, let's see.
Oh my God. So they just stand out, like out of nowhere.
Yeah, and we know this had to have been transported aboard an iceberg for the simple reason that if it was carried within the glacier mass, like a typical glacier erratic, you wouldn't have those sharp square corners like that. A glacier erratic gets ground off.
Right.
And oftentimes, this thing was transported almost 200 miles from, its likely origin was Mount Robeson, and we didn't get to this one. But this is evidence that the flooding was much more extensive than just the Missoula flooding. Because this is, the Missoula flooding that we were looking at was on the west side of the North American continental divide.
I should just jump in there and say that it isn't any longer controversial that there was gigantic flooding in the Pacific Northwest and indeed across the whole range just south of the ice cap. That is accepted now. But the very idea that there was flooding at all was hotly opposed for decades. There was a great American geologist called J. Harlan Bretz, who was the first to document the fact that there had been colossal flooding in that area. And he lived in the 1900s, the 1920s, and because he suggested that there had been a cataclysm, of course, he was exiled by his colleagues. Eventually, his data prevailed, and he was awarded the Penrose Medal, the highest award of the geology in America, in 1976 when he was like 96 years old.
That must have sucked for him.
And he said then, he said, all my enemies are dead, so I have no one left to gloat over.
That's what he said? Yes. Oh my God. But it's so disturbing to me that it works like that.
Yeah, it works like that. So,
they're
but
demonized.
what happened, you see, was Harlan Bretz was convinced from the beginning that he was dealing, and this is a very experienced field geologist, that he was dealing with a single humongous flood, which had risen and fallen within perhaps 2 weeks. That was his evidence on the ground, and he was attacked because people kept saying, well, where did the water come from? You know, what's the source of this water? And he said, that's not my problem. I am showing you the clear, unmistakable evidence of flooding on the ground. Flooding happened. Somebody else go work out where the water came from. And this stuck the whole argument for the best part of 40 years, until a compromise was reached, and that's the word that Randall used, Missoula. They said that this flooding was caused by outburst floods from a glacial lake that's referred to as Glacial Lake Missoula. And because the flooding is so extensive, it must have outburst 80 or 90 times to cause that flooding, which completely contradicts Harlan Bretz's view that it was a 2-week flood, one single event. But the compromise was accepted that the cause of the flooding was Glacial Lake Missoula. That is now going to have to be reviewed because of the comet evidence. If J. Harlan Bretz had the information we have today, he would have known instantly what caused that single humongous flood, and that was the liquidizing of a huge area of the North American ice cap instantly, and the floods that followed.
It's so fascinating that the obsessions of a few people come together like this, and you can kind of piece these things together on a podcast. Randall, what is this crazy image you're showing
Well, this is
us?
actually out of a 19th century text when before catastrophism had been completely exorcised from mainstream geology. And this was Louis Figuier, I think was his name, who speculated that the ice sheets over northwestern Europe had catastrophically melted down. And he had an illustration in his geology text which perfectly captures how these large erratics are actually being transported aboard these icebergs. And you can see the scale of the thing. And this is the kind of, you see whole forests are about to be washed away here. And this image, when first time I saw it, I thought, well, here it is. This depicts the kind of field evidence that we've been looking at here. So that's why I've included this here, because it helps to visualize what we're talking about. We've got some this was a place that Graham and I visited here, which really spectacularly embodies this whole phenomenon. This is known as Dry Falls Cataract, and it's about 5 miles wide, and I'm going to show you ground photographs and a couple of aerial photographs of it, so you can kind of get the scale of the thing. Now,
the great thing is anybody can go there. Yeah. This is on the land. It's ours to look at. We can all go and see this. It's an amazing trip to see it.
You could go to Joe. They would let you in there to see this.
Where were you trespassing?
Oh, that was
on that particular shot, that huge 18,000-ton boulder is surrounded by notices which say no trespassing.
They weren't there when I was there a
Don't
few
step
years
on
ago.
it. So I trespassed. I mean, the thing is made of basalt, and my footstep is not going to do it any harm.
Yeah, I bet
got
you
on top.
nobody even noticed that Graham had been up there. in
So
the
it's
aftermath.
not like a private property issue. It's like they're just trying to keep people.
I think it is actually a private property.
Probably
issue.
is,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I have noticed from the first time I went there, which was, gosh, I don't know, 98, I think, there was no houses on that hillside. Now the houses are moving up the hillside. There's been development and so forth. There was
course.
houses pretty much right around it. So
Yeah, we're gonna overrun it, and there'll be no evidence. You guys got to accumulate your evidence while you can before condos go up there.
right now you'll notice that there's a series of these alcoves here that these horseshoe shaped.
Back on the image of Dry Falls.
Back on the image of Dry Falls, exactly. And at some point, somebody's going to be able to see these images, right?
Yeah, well, people can go and Google them online, but they'll see them
Okay.
right now on YouTube if they watch the YouTube version
If they
of the
see
show.
the YouTube, okay. So here's a typical Horseshoe Falls of Niagara, which is a modern cataract, receding cataract. And this horseshoe shape is very typical of the way water will erode bedrock, because water flows faster in the middle of the stream, therefore it erodes faster in the middle, and not so much as you get towards the margins. And so it creates this classic horseshoe-shaped profile. And that's what we're seeing here at Dry Falls. Now, this is just one of the alcoves, of about half a dozen of the alcoves that we saw in the map of it.
In other words, this is a monstrously big waterfall.
Yes. Now,
Dry today.
just off to the left of the picture is where, actually, and there's a photograph in Graham's book taken from, back we skipped over. There it is. This is the viewpoint, and this is Horseshoe Falls of Niagara superimposed on Dry Falls, so you can get a sense of the scale.
So Niagara Falls is a tiny, tiny little thing
Yeah.
by comparison with this ancient fossilized waterfall, which dates back 12,800 years. Niagara Falls is the result of 12,000 or more years of work of the river. Dry Falls between Upper and Lower Grand Coulee in Washington State is the result of 2 weeks of flooding.
What?
Yeah. And
For people, try to explain this for people that are listening, because it's probably 10 times bigger plus.
more than that.
How many times bigger?
It's 2.5 times as high. And well, figure this, the discharge of the Niagara River over the falls is a couple of 100,000 cubic feet per second maximum. The discharge over Grand Coulee was somewhere between 300 and 400 million cubic feet per second, or in other words, somewhere between 10 and 20 times the combined flow of every river on Earth flowing all at once. And the height of this scarp face here, this cliff, is about 400 feet.
Oh my
The
God.
water coming over was about 400 feet deep. So if you were here, witnessing this at the peak of the flood, you wouldn't in fact even see a waterfall. What you would see is this massive 10-mile wide turgid river choked with icebergs and debris and whole forests
And that
had
river
been
is
ripped
rather
up.
flowing at what, 60, 70 miles an hour?
60, 70 miles an hour. What you would have seen here was just a bump in this flood. And then only at the latter stages of it would it actually have been a waterfall. As the water source was dissipating and as the water was declining, you would have the final stage of it being a waterfall, then eventually the waterfall stopped, and what you have today is this fossilized feature of this massive, and this is only one of about a half a dozen comparable sized cataracts. We didn't get to see Potholes or Frenchman Coulee next time, perhaps.
So many others. I'd
Yeah.
urge anybody listening to this, if you can do so, get up to Washington State and go visit Upper and Lower Grand Coulee. It's a stunning landscape. It's a great trip to make, and you can see the evidence on the ground.
And people don't know about it. We've got, like, here, this is Utah, and what you see here is once you begin to understand cataract formation, and you understand the morphology of a cataract, you look at something like this, and what you're looking at is cataracts, extinct cataracts out in Canyonlands, Utah, and they're massively scaled. But no geologists, see, here's the problem. Geologists haven't been focused on catastrophism. What they've been doing, they work for the government, they work for the oil companies. They're more interested in what's down below, the natural gas, the oil and
That's where
stuff.
the money is.
There's another
Yeah.
point. There's another point I'd like to add to that, Randall, as to
Yeah.
why geologists are not focused on catastrophes. Geology is a science, and science, in effect, defined itself as being different from religious superstition. So the notion of the Great Flood that we find in the Bible became a very discredited notion in science, and by association with that, any suggestion of a great cataclysm in the past was seen as superstitious behavior, to be shunned completely by the skeptical and shiny new sciences, who must never take that into account. So any geologist who dares to propose a cataclysmic episode is up against that right away. That his colleagues don't want to go there because they're afraid that they're going to be accused of buying into Noah's flood or whatever.
That's so unfortunate.
But it's true, and this is the problem. So there's catastrophism and uniformitarianism. The prevailing dogma in geology is the uniformitarian dogma, which is basically to say the way we see things in the world today, that's how it's always been. It's never been any change.
So, Randall, what is the mainstream understanding of those formations? Like when they look at those
Utah ones,
gigantic Utah,
I have searched and searched, and I find nothing.
they just don't explain it.
They don't explain
They just
it.
go, "Oh, look how pretty."
do you think
Yeah.
the flooding went as far south as Utah?
Not directly glacial. I think what we're looking there has to be torrential rain.
Right.
Torrential-
Is another association of this impact.
Yes.
Picture this huge impacts on the ice cap. An enormous amount of watery material is thrown up into the atmosphere. Not only water, but also mud, and you get this rain out,
Yeah.
which comes down for a long period after that.
And I'm not necessarily saying that all of that was stripped in one event, because the Pleistocene is basically 2.5 million years. I think 2.6 million is the latest dating of it. And there's been probably a dozen or 24 ice ages that have come and gone. To me, the evidence I'm seeing suggests that the transition from glacial to interglacial and back again is not a smooth process. In fact, it's probably highly catastrophic. Not necessarily as catastrophic as the event we're talking about 12,000 years ago, but certainly catastrophic enough that were an event of equivalent magnitude to happen today, we could maybe not cause a mass extinction, but we could certainly pull the plug on modern civilization. And so this picture is interesting because what it does is it shows that, you know, you travel over this landscape.
Explain what this picture is and where is it?
Okay, you know, now this is in western Montana, and this is a place called Dry Creek, and what this is just a gravel pit. But what you see here is deposits caused by surging floodwaters moving up tributary valleys, loaded with sediment. And one of the things that a stratigrapher or a sedimentologist looks at is, you notice how they're tilted. You see how the layers are tilted? Okay, that's an indication of which direction the water is moving. The tilting goes down in the direction that the water is flowing. So what we see here is massive, turbulent, sediment-laden floodwaters back-flooding up a valley, surging, leaving deposits, and then flowing back out, followed by another wave, for 13,000 years, 12,000 years. This material has been laying there, and you see that there's forest. Okay, people traveling over this landscape don't see what's under their feet, you see. But once you get an outcrop like this, and you understand and you can read what you're seeing here, then suddenly it becomes apparent that the very hills and landscape that we live on, that we built our cities on, and our highways, and that we're playing out all these dramas, that right under our feet is the evidence of previous worlds. You have to understand that what you're looking at there is the debris of a former world that was pulverized by these floods, carried in and deposited, and now a new world has emerged out of that and on top of this wreckage, this
And in that
room.
former world existed, I believe, an advanced civilization that is memorized in myths and traditions all around the world, that is being ridiculed by archaeologists, but it is insistent. It keeps on coming forward.
It's all shocking and stunning and fantastic, but it all makes sense.
I think it does make sense, and I think it's it's something. It's part of the human heritage. With again, one of the things I find encouraging about the world today is that more and more people themselves. When we took the word of specialists, Professor Y said this, it had to be true. That was so, actually, when I wrote things. That was the first argument, was the argument from authority. The authorities say this cannot be so, therefore it is not so. And a lot of people just bought that. What's changed, I think, in the last 20 years is that subservience to authority has gone away. It hasn't gone away completely, but we don't trust them, rightly and properly, because we've been lied to by authority figures, and we know it. We saw the evidence, whether it's politicians or big corporations or other big religions. There's an uprising against this and an assertion of individual will and of individual intellect to inquire into the past. And I think that's why this information now is coming at a time where it's falling on fertile ground. There will still be a lot of resistance to it. We can expect to go on, but things are shifting in the world, just as our picture of the past is shifting as well.
Have you guys thought about coming together and doing a documentary?
I'd love to do a documentary.
You guys together, it's a must-do. I mean, it just seems like the book is, I'm sure, going to be fantastic, but there's going to be people that are just not going to read a book. Yeah. Documentaries are so easy. All you just do is open your stupid mouth, lay down, turn on Netflix, and bam. You can absorb it.
It might happen.
People are lazy.
It's highly visual material, and it's
so visual. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's so visual, and the two of them together. We need to crowdfund something.
Can I make it appeal? It's the first time I've ever done this. It's a kind of little pitch.
It's a little pitch.
Okay, I've never asked for this before. Okay. What I'm asking to those who value and appreciate my work and feel that I'm doing something useful in the world, please support my work by getting this book, because that is the best way to put one finger up to the mainstream. Archaeology wants this book to go away. They want it to be forgotten. It will never be reviewed in any mainstream newspaper. It will never be written about. There will be no articles about it, and probably no television. The only thing that can make a difference to people. I'm asking that now, of people who value my work.
People are huge fans.
I hugely deeply appreciate the support that my readers have given me. I would be nothing without my readers. That's why every time I do an event, I sit there for 2 to 3 hours afterwards talking about books, signing books, because the readers are the most important people in my universe. They're who give me strength. Without my readers, I'm literally nothing, and I value them, I appreciate them. And I'm on a journey across America now. I'm speaking in many different cities. The program is up on my website on the talks and events.
The entirety of the time you're here, just let me know where you're going to be, and I'll let everybody know.
We're plugging. That's it. Well, it's about a 4.5-hour presentation.
Of course it is.
Of graphics, video clips, animation, and
and what is it? What is it called?
Cosmic Habits. Website. Cameron Wiltshire, who you know, in fact, who introduced us. Doing a special.
So what is the actual URL of the website?
It would be safety.com.
James pulled it up right there. 33.33% off. What is that?
Apparently. And you'll notice magicians.
There you go. Magicians of the Gods.
That must be a reference.
I think it probably corresponds. think that you guys have to do one of these things together as a documentary. I think someone out there, there's probably some kooks that we don't want to do this documentary, but somebody out there that's legit. We can find them and put it together.
Yeah, I want to pay tribute to Randall's work. Randall is a really important figure in this field, and he's very understood the fantastic knowledge that this man has, and the ground experience. You can't beat that.
Well, I met Randall. God, it was early 2000s, right?
When you were at the country.
Yeah, in Atlanta.
Yeah.
Which doesn't even exist anymore.
Close to 10 years ago.
It was quite a while ago. And we had this conversation after my show, and we were just sitting down. He was talking to me about the Holocene, all these different impacts, and I remember walking away. We talked for quite a while after the show. But I remember going, that might be the craziest fucking post-show conversation I've ever had. Because usually, after a comedy show, you have a conversation with people, hey, where's a good place to eat? Do you like Atlanta? Like normal stuff. And he's just flooding me with information. I'm like, who is this guy?
Well, I remember walking away from it going, wow, I had no idea that Joe Rogan really related to all this stuff,
Oh, I was fascinated.
I was surprised.
Can I add something there, which is I'd like to say something about you, Joe. It's a phenomenon. I travel all around the world, and I give presentations in just countries everywhere. And everywhere I go, people come up to me and they said, Joe Rogan sent us to you. We know about your work because of Joe Rogan. And I see that what you're doing is exploring many, many controversial areas in your show. You're in a position of power, and your listeners, just as my readers are my strength, your listeners are your strength. They've put you in a position of power, but you're a person who's using that power for something really good. There are so many people who are powerful in the world of the media who just waste it away on trivia and nothing. You are bringing new information to people all around the world, and I can tell you, because I meet them every time I give an event, you are enormously appreciated.
Well, I appreciate them very much, and I appreciate you guys, and I appreciate this show, because this whole thing came about without any planning. This show just sort of became itself. It's almost like I would just happen to be there to germinate it or something. And I just try to get out of my own way as much as possible and follow my curiosity. And the beautiful thing about people like you guys is, without you, take away you and Fingerprints of the Gods, take away you, and what are we looking at? I mean, it's very rare when you have two human beings that without them, an entire field of study would be barren of a great deal of its information. I mean, you have John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, and you were obviously a part of all that. And John Anthony West, who's absolutely fascinating.
Fascinating guy.
And another guy, widely maligned, a guy who's ignored, but Magical Egypt is one of the greatest DVD series to this day that I've ever seen in my life. And if you've got the time and the attention span to sit down and watch all of them, it is amazing.
Amazing. John Anthony West is one of my favorite people on the planet.
He's incredible.
Brilliant researcher. John, more than anybody else who opened my mind to the history of Egypt. Fantastic.
He's a world treasure.
He is a world treasure. Great.
That DVD series is just one petal, one unfolding of the great flower of information that you guys are presenting. And I think...
And another name I'll drop in there, which is Robert Bobzombie, the originator of the Iraq Relations. He's done so much to bring back attention to the importance of the pyramids in the ancient world. What the understanding of our past, and again, his evidence also points back to this period of 12,800 years.
And while we're at it, Robert Schoch, who really stuck his neck out for Boston University, really one of the first mainstream scholars that went out on a limb and said, we are absolutely looking at water erosion.
Robert Schoch is a key figure in this field. He's very courageous to be a mainstream academic, to be a professor of geology at Foster. It was John West who introduced Robert Schoch to the notion that the Sphinx might be much older, whether it didn't fit with the and John took Robert Schoch to Egypt. He's taken a lot of tax for it.
Well, all of you guys are just massively important. This is such a unique and satisfying object of curiosity. For me, at least, when I start thinking about these things, it's almost like little things start firing off in my brain. It's so exciting. I mean, it's terrific to think about the poor people that lived back then that got hit by these massive impacts, and the aftermath of it all must have been insane. But to think about now, in 2015, the slow unveiling of all this data and information, and as it all gets into focus and you try to get a clearer and clearer view of what could have possibly happened in the past, I find it so incredibly enriching and fascinating. It's, to me, one of the most exciting aspects of the potential of archaeology.
Yeah.
Just to be able to discover, like, oh, that's what happened. Oh,
yeah. It's
that
a
makes
kind of
lot
aha
sense.
moment.
Yes.
Suddenly the pieces fall into place, and we
Yes.
understand what we feel.
And again, it cements that statement that you made that resonated with me, that we are a civilization with amnesia.
We got knocked on the head, and we lost it. We lost a lot, and there is that haunting sense of incompleteness within so many of us that comes from that lost memory. I feel it's like any amnesiac has a sense of something missing. The whole species has that.
I think what makes this really so potent is the fact that there are considerable implications for our own future.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that, you know, how Graham wraps up the book really is about our future. You know, and once now that we've integrated this information into our worldview, you know, what does it imply in terms of where we go from here? Because one of the things that I track, and if you could throw this up on the screen for just a second, I'm going to speed through something really quick here so that you can kind of get the impression.
1989.
Let me just...
Giant asteroid makes close call by Earth.
While Randall's fixing that, let's also remind that we had a relatively close pass with a half-kilometer wide, actually bit of a comet just over Halloween.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that NASA only found that object on the 10th of October.
Right.
And it missed us. It passed about the distance of the moon from the Earth.
That's not that far.
That's
No.
not that far. But the thing,
No.
the key thing is that they only found it a few days before it passed.
Oh, God.
And how many other objects?
Half a kilometer wide.
Half a
Yeah.
kilometer wide.
So the one that hit Tunguska was
100 meters. The tiny.
Jesus
tiny,
Christ,
Yes.
it's freaking me out.
This is a minimum of 150 to 200 times the volume of Tunguska.
And when you look at the universe, and just look at our galaxy, the size of our galaxy, look at our solar system, the size of our solar system, that is literally like getting grazed by a bullet. It's like getting grazed.
Absolutely.
And
Clips
so
off a bit of your
close.
ear.
That's a good analogy.
It's a really good analogy. Yeah.
When you think about it, you know, you say, well, a half a kilometer compared to the Earth, that's not big.
Oh.
But like when, you know, you think of a slug from a 32, right? If I threw it at you and hit you with it, it wouldn't do much. But if I accelerate it to 1,000 feet per second, it's going to cause extreme trauma, right? But now we're looking at these asteroids flying in comet debris, and they're 10 times, 20 times the speed of a rifle bullet when they hit our atmosphere. Like, you know, 60,000 miles per hour.
Yeah.
And the kinetic punch of something like that is inconceivable. It's like Graham said, I mean, to talk about it, you'd have to take our entire nuclear arsenal of the peak of the Cold War, detonate it all at once, and even that would only be a fraction of the forces unleashed. Now watch this. I'm going to go through this real quick here, and you'll get the idea, I think, that where we're at, because astronomers are looking out into our cosmic environment, and this is what they're seeing. Look at this.
Well,
Like,
let's explain
going back
this,
here,
'cause most of us are listening, not
9
watching.
objects have come close to the Earth since 1991. Right?
Read that.
Yeah,
Current
asteroid estimates are too low. This was
Way too
October
low.
of 2000.
current predictions for the number of potentially dangerous there are between 750 and 900 asteroids
Let me tell you.
circling the Earth.
Yeah.
That number has changed.
Yes.
That report's
Yes.
from October 2000.
Yes.
We're now looking at the estimates are now that it's 100,000. potentially Earth-destroying objects that are on Earth-crossing orbits. This is an estimate. The problem is NASA has only identified a tiny fraction of what's out there. And again, I'm not saying this because I want to spread gloom and doom. I'm saying this. I'm saying this because we have the capacity to do something about it.
Right.
It takes goodwill on the part of the human race to stop wasting money on stupid pursuits, particularly warfare, and to apply those resources to sweeping clean our cosmic environment. The technology already exists.
It's going to cause I mean, it's going to have to be. There's going to have to be a massive shift in our attention. Like there has to almost be an event that takes place that makes people wake up.
Right. We have World Asteroid Day right now. Some prominent figures are behind it, like Brian May. I think he was one of the guitarists with Queen, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
There is publicity around so-called World Asteroid Day, but nobody's taking it seriously.
Well, we don't take anything seriously unless it smacks us. Like people don't quit cigarettes until they get cancer. There's something about human beings that we don't consider the we have this idea in our head that we're eternal and we're gonna live forever and everything's gonna be fine. And I just need to, you know what I mean? I need this box that I have out of my eye on, or this laptop that I want to buy. If something happened, if a massive collision hit China and wiped out like several million people, and then caused the entire Earth to go into nuclear winter, and crops died, and we experienced global famine, then something like that, then we would wake up and go, all right, Russia, let's talk. Let's get together.
I'm hoping that it doesn't take anything quite that extreme. If
too.
we had a repeat of Tunguska in 1908, I think that would be enough to do it.
That would be nice. But would it be? Because there was this incident in Russia that was last year that was caught on all those dashboard cameras. What's a wonderful thing about Russia is apparently there's so much like insurance crime and so many collisions with each other. That's how we have all this footage. Some from inside schools where people were watching like this thing happen and go down, and that was nothing.
That was a fraction of the size of the Tunguska. Yeah, but nobody was killed. You see, if that object had been a little bigger, if it's a little denser, its angle of attention a little steeper, you might have been looking at 1,500 deaths rather than just 1,500 injuries. I think that would have been a wake-up call. Perhaps. Maybe not enough to reorient civilization. But I guarantee you, a Tunguska event over a major inhabited area of the globe, wiping out 1 million people, I can't imagine that wouldn't have some kind of a effect on our attitude toward our vulnerability in the cosmos. And make people think maybe there's something bigger we need to be paying attention to here rather than, Kardashian's
We've got to realize
butt.
we're not invulnerable. This is the illusion created.
Well, Congress just passed.
At least that would be a useful project.
Yes.
Is to actually do something that could benefit and serve the race instead of multiplying fear and hatred.
Well, see, that's the thing. These asteroids are actually extraordinary sources of resources. Natural resources, water and precious metals, all of these things exist in those asteroids that are threatening the planet. Right. And we're not that far away from being able to develop the technology with an asteroid. Of course, it's a matter of, like Graham was saying, I mean, this last Halloween asteroid, they didn't find it but a couple of weeks before it passed by the Earth. So we need a lot more capability of seeing what's out there. And we're developing it, but at a very slow pace.
So there are practical suggestions that come out of all of this. This isn't just about the past, as Randall said. This is also about the future of the human race and what we do and how we live on this gorgeous planet that the universe gave us, and how we pay back for being given that opportunity.
And so current ideas are to somehow or another nudge these asteroids out of the way.
There's about 10 different technologies to do it. What you don't really want to do is to blow it up with a nuclear bomb, because then you get buckshot instead of a single bullet. And buckshot can do a lot of harm as well, and it may even push it into a more catastrophic orbit. So you don't want to do that. But what you can do, for example, is to change the reflectivity of one side of the asteroid or comet fragment. You can alter that, effectively paint it, and that affects the sun's radiation upon it, and that would be enough to shift it slightly out of its course. There are a lot of techniques and suggestions, or nudges. This is you put your finger on exactly the right word. This is another of the technologies that you just nudge these things. You just don't need to do much, and you put them into a safe place instead of a danger.
Such a bizarre idea that there's hundreds of thousands of killers out there. You just have to, excuse me, just over there, please. A little bit of this. And then also we have to look out for all of them. The ones that are coming from down there, the ones that are coming from up here.
Three-dimensional space.
That's
got to look
that's
out.
what we'll have to think of, because when we look at the sky, oh, hoping asteroids aren't coming our way. This thing is crazy.
And is it coming from the direction of the sun so that we can't see it, except with very special
And
cameras?
that was the case with Tunguska. It came out of effect. The eyewitness accounts, they described how it looked like it was being disgorged from the sun or being expelled from the sun. It was like a second sun in the sky, and that was because that summertime torrid stream is coming from behind the sun. And so, yeah, you can't see them.
Well, because of the gravity of the sun, the mass of the sun, doesn't that affect how we see things behind it anyway?
Yeah, it should do.
It warps
time
our vision.
Yeah.
So like something could be coming from behind the sun. We literally would not even see it because of the mass and gravity of the sun if it was in the right area.
Yeah, Tunguska was not seen really until it came into the atmosphere.
That was obviously a long time ago, and there was not nearly as much observation of the skies as there are today, right?
These are the steps that we need to take. We need to grow up as our childhood. It's interesting to speculate what would happen if we had impacts on the scale that happened 12,800 years ago. And I'm pretty sure that it would mean, if it were allowed to happen, that it would mean the end of our civilization. This civilization would go down. This is a very intensely specialized civilization. I think the just-in-time principle is that we have 2-day or 3-day food supply in our cities. You interrupt that, and you have a kind of Walking Dead scenario within a week. You know, it's that bad. This civilization appears to be very strong, but in fact it's very fragile, and it could easily fall apart. And so many of us in the Western technological world actually have no survival skills whatsoever. We don't know how to survive because we depend for our survival upon the complex network of society. Who would survive a cataclysm like that? Would be the hunter-gatherers. People like the hunter-gatherers of the Kalahari in southern Africa, or the hunter-gatherers of the Amazon basin. You know, the meek of the world, those who are not taken into account in the world at all today. They're the ones equipped both with the knowledge and the psychological resources to deal with a situation like that and to carry the human story forward. And I just want to make sure, if I can play some part in this, I just want to make sure that the descendants of those hunter-gatherers 10,000 years in the future are not remembering faintly and vaguely a great lost civilization, a magical civilization which had the ability to go to the moon, which had the ability to, one person could speak to another person on the other side of the planet, magical powers, which was destroyed because of its own arrogance and cruelty. And that lost civilization, of course, would be us.
Well, one of the things that's been disturbing me as I got older is the idea of print, about books, is sort of going away, and everything is becoming digital. And digital to the form that you can only read with an operating system and a computer and a CPU and all that jazz. Without all that, it's nothing. You look at a hard drive, it's just, there's nothing there.
It's just electrons.
Yeah.
Take away the software, and it'll never be read again.
Yeah, and what evidence would there be 1,000 years from now of us if something were to happen?
There might be some. We know they were computer disks, but
Right.
the descendants of that time would have no idea what they were, and even if they did, they'd have no way of accessing.
And 1,000 years from now, they would deteriorate to nothing anyway.
To nothing. All the plastic would be gone. Everything would just be a complete mess.
Well, that's why I look at megalithic stone architecture as textbook.
Yeah.
That's how you might preserve things. And another way you might preserve things, if you develop a mythology around this whole scenario, and then you projected it onto the night sky, so that generations later they would tell these tales based upon the mythological figures juxtaposed on the night sky, and there would be the story, because it's there. It's all the whole mythos, Western mythology, has been juxtaposed onto the fixed stars. And so that's one way, perhaps, of preserving information. And the other way, I think, is massive stone architecture.
So it's clearly not an accident that the Great Pyramid encodes the dimensions of our planet.
Yes,
It encodes them. You measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200. And you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth.
Why that number, though? Why?
Well, that's the key thing, and I'll come to that in a second, if I may. You take the height of the Great Pyramid, multiply that by 43,200, and you get the total radius of the Earth. Actually, Egyptologists know this, but they say it's a complete coincidence. What's the significance of 43,200? But actually, it's a highly significant number. It's a number that is found embedded in mythology all around the world, and it is a multiple of the number 72. It's actually 600 times 72, and 72 is the heartbeat of the precessional cycle. 1 degree change every 72 years. So what they've actually done is they've given us the dimensions of our planet on a scale defined by a motion of the planet itself. And that, in my view, is an incredibly clever way to pass information down. That way they can be sure that any astronomically literate society could work this out. The information would be there. So in all those dark ages, when we had no knowledge that we even lived on a planet or what its dimensions were, those dimensions were encoded into the enduring structure of the Great Pyramid, a monument, as the Arabs say, that time itself would fear.
The Great Pyramids themselves, the Great Pyramid of Giza in particular, is so spectacular that it almost makes you go, well, man, there had to be something going on. We must be missing part of this picture, because you're talking about something that of course we could. Of course we could. We can you make a stone that's the size of one of the stones in the Great Pyramid? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, then we can make the pyramid. But how long would it take?
Yeah.
How hard would it be?
And where would be the will?
And you'd have to be perfect.
Yeah.
In order to get it to line up at the top the way it sets right now.
Exactly.
You can't be off by a fraction of an inch.
Otherwise, you have a corkscrew instead of a pyramid. That's the whole problem. No, it's an amazing device, a multifunctional device, in my view, in encoding knowledge, but also working on human consciousness. I've had the privilege to be alone inside the Great Pyramid, not surrounded by hundreds of others. And as the silence descends, this sense of intelligence seems to come out from the walls. Something is speaking to you there, and I think that partly what it was to affect
just with
beckoning
its
people.
majestic structure, just being so magnificent and incredible that you just go, whoa.
But also the sensory deprivation element, you know, that you're inside the so-called king's chamber, which had nothing to do with any king. This amazing granite geometrical room 300 feet above the ground in the heart of the Great Pyramid. As that silence descends, you feel this monument begin to speak to you. It's almost like it's shy. Put 50 people in there, and the dialogue goes away. Be in there alone. Listen to the sound.
It's just, it's such a special thing that we have. This area where you can see these ancient structures, and it causes your mind to wander and think about these things and these possibilities. When you add that, all the information that you've got, of course, with your study and your research, it's just an amazing thing.
I should mention another site, which we've not talked about today, which is Gunung Padang in Indonesia. And again, I have chapters on this in the new book. Gunung Padang is a man-made pyramid found about 3 hours drive west of Bandung on the island of Java. site there is a megalithic site that was thought to be a natural hill. But now, an amazing Indonesian geologist called Danny Hillman, Natamajaja, has been over it with his team. They've done ground penetration. Remnants of man-made material associated with datable organic material that goes back 20,000 years. It goes back right into the last ice age. This is a 20,000-year-old pyramid sitting in Indonesia, and it's one of the most exciting breaking stories in archaeology. And typically, because the discovery work has been done by a geologist, Indonesian archaeologists are wanting full work stopped.
So this is it right here?
That's not good.
It says
those are good and put out. So for example, third to the left.
So this is accepted by archaeologists, not by archaeologists?
Yeah, the archaeologists say, oh, we know that site, it's 2,500 years old, there's nothing of interest there, we would like the resources that we spend on this to be spent on our project instead. And in fact, they've lobbied with the Indonesian government and the excavations have been temporarily halted. I think that it will go ahead again.
What is the evidence that shows, what's the geological evidence that shows that this is...
First of all, the ground penetrating radar, the picture of what is inside this, shows us that it is a man-made hill, not a natural hill. Secondly, that it contains 3 large chambers within it. One of them at least as large as the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. Huge cavities, regular in shape, which have not yet been excavated. And thirdly, that the data puts us back to 20,000 years, right to the last glacial maximum, when Indonesia didn't look at all the way it looks today. Indonesia 20,000 years ago was part of a giant continent that geologists call Sundaland, the Sunda Shelf. It wasn't a peninsula, the Malaysian peninsula and the 1,000 islands of Indonesia. It was a massive landmass. And that landmass was submerged predominantly between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. This site sits in an area of high land, which was never submerged. And it looks to me, again, I'm speculating because the excavation has been stopped, but it looks to me, as does Göbekli Tepe, like a time capsule, something that takes us back to that earlier period. And in fact, when we're looking for a lost civilization, I think we should be looking all over the world. Plato made it clear that Atlantis wasn't just the island; it had projected its power all around the world. Indonesia is a very fruitful area for further investigation, and I did a huge research trip in Indonesia, and I saw megaliths that are just unaccounted for. The archaeology has never been done. There's a giant megalith culture in that island, and very cool. Some cultures on Indonesia are still making megaliths today. They're still doing it.
So when we're looking at this, what are you guys seeing? I'm seeing a hill, I'm seeing a bunch of rocks.
Yeah, that bunch of rocks is the known megalithic site, which has correctly been dated to 2,500 years ago.